Hello and welcome to video 2 in the week of Ensler. Today we're going to be talking about I'm an Emotional Creature. I hated this book so much that I couldn't finish it sober, and I was trying to give it the benefit of the doubt until I was, 3 glasses into rosé. I liked what this book was trying to do, as it stated in the foreword and the introduction, that it was trying to look at girls claiming their emotions and the energy that comes from that, and confronting the fear that adults have of this raw emotion and the patriarchal fear of girlhood emotion because it's uncontrollable and frenetic, and also confronting the false narratives that were made to tell ourselves when it comes to masculinity and adolescence, even younger, as well as adult women, people who disconnect themselves from their emotions. Obviously, I love that this is about looking at the power of girls and how being emotional can be resistance. Love it. Hated the execution of it. I think I'm going to start with talking about the author's authority in this text. Ensler is coming into this book given a decade, maybe more actually, of recognition through the vagina monologues. She has this social currency, this public respect that she's garnered as a writer, as a feminist, all of it. And this book is definitely modeled after the vagina monologues in terms of its structure, the way that narrative is told. There's maybe a little bit more poetry in this one, but it's essentially the same kind of thing. To the point where I feel like everything she did with the vagina monologues was just transposed onto I'm an Emotional Creature, but done in a way that's supposed to encapsulate a global girlhood, and which we'll talk about in a second, and I really did not feel like that worked. The first thing that bothered me when reading the text is that it is so blatantly written by someone who is a baby boomer, written by a non-millennial, written by an adult, and it's supposed to be all about girlhood. The first actual monologue that we get into is from the perspective of a teenage girl living in North America, suburbia, the pressure of wearing the right name brands, who you're friends with, that kind of Western, I guess, North American media depicted teenage girlhood. And it was so cringy. I understand it's hard to validate the experiences of teenage girls when we're so used to devaluing them ourselves, but it was just so clearly written by not a teenager. And so the first thing that I wrote at the top of that monologue was let the girls tell their own stories. Because that's what I find the most infuriating about this book, is that Eve Ensler has all of this social currency. She has organizations, NGOs, all this great work that she does. She has the power to just ask for submissions, right? Okay, let's look at the author's note actually as we're unpacking all of this. So in terms of discussing her methodology, this is what she says. These monologues are not interviews. Each monologue is a literary text inspired by traveling the world, by witnessing events, by listening to real and imagined conversations. On occasion, a monologue was inspired by an article, an experience, a memory, a dream, a wish, an image, or a moment of grief or rage. Why does Ensler need to tell these stories? The vagina monologues, okay, it was revolutionary, radical for its time. She amassed all these stories and then told them, and they're largely about grown women, cis women. She's coming to this with the success of vagina monologues, where now she has a huge voice and impact, and then she does the same thing instead of giving up her space for marginalized girlhood voices, right? That's what I find infuriating, is that she has this authority over the stories instead of giving up space. And giving up space is essential to supporting people who are experiencing systematic oppression, because she speaks to these experiences heavily in the book. What it feels like she's trying to do in the book is create a sense of universal girlhood, which I find uncomfortable. And it's not that I didn't want her to include voices from around the world at all. Obviously those should be included, but again, how are those being included? Who's telling those stories? But what she would do is she would write this really good piece that was specific to one girl in one situation, but then at the end of the piece, she would like draw it out to say that it encapsulated all these other people in different identities. To me, she just wasn't honoring specific stories. She was just trying to assume it into like a melting pot of a universal girlhood. Again, going back to her methodology and storytelling, I felt this a little bit with the vagina monologues and more so with this one, where it's like, who has ownership over these stories, right? Because she's saying that they're inspired by story that she's heard, that she's read, listening to people. My question then is, whose stories are these really? Because I feel like her saying like, oh, these are inspired by real experiences, mean that she's assuming away her own responsibility and accountability to the story she's telling. I also didn't feel that she necessarily would have done these stories justice. I mean, I have no other experience than being a white middle class person in Canada, but I felt like a lot of the stuff she went into, like, she didn't give kind of nuanced understandings. I feel like there was a little bit of like stereotypical representations, and like, not that it wasn't necessarily untrue, but it was like maybe you could have done more to complicate the way that we think about girls around the world. Like for instance, the one narrative of a girl from China is a girl who works in a factory, which isn't an untrue experience, but it's not the only experience. There was also particularly like not okay, uncomfortable moments where she wasn't just speaking to a person's experience, and this is specifically with like indigeneity, where she just said indigenous, which could mean anything, right? And then she was actually speaking to specific like cultural things and not just the girl's experience, where I was like, oh, no. She also used slurs against trans people in this book that was written like 5 years ago. And I didn't always feel that certain topics were approached the best. I didn't feel like there was really a nuanced understanding of agency. It felt like there was like assumptions of victimhood in certain places. And again, with Ensler's work, like I talked about in the Vagina Monologues, I felt like there was this underlying, not as explicit as in the Vagina Monologues, but like a little bit more implicit in this one, in terms of essentializing language. Like it felt like she was trying to reclaim something about girls and women that is devalued and attacked under patriarchal systems of oppression, but she also kind of reinforced it at the same time by saying that this is what we are. We are emotional. We are this way. We process our emotions this way. But there were definitely parts of it that I liked. There were parts that I connected to. I also read this as a 20-year-old. If I had read this when I was younger, I would have been all over it. I guarantee you. This is the last like book that I disliked for this week. The last book that I will be talking about next, In the Body of the World, which is one of her memoirs. I really enjoyed. One of my favorite books of last year when I read all of these. So yeah,